Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So I am going to be continuing my attempt to catch up my wrap-ups. This one I'm going to go pretty quickly through the books because it's been like 6 months and also there are a lot of them. So this is going to be, as you'll have seen from the title, May and June. And I don't own a lot of these books. I'm finding I either unhauled them or I didn't own them in the first place. So let's jump into the books that I read in May. So the first book that I read in May is the sequel to The Sisters of the Vast Black, and that is The Sisters of the Forsaken Stars by Lena Rather. And this book follows the same cast of characters from the first book, and they were kind of seeing what they're doing in the aftermath of the events of that book. Don't want to give away anything because it would be spoilers, but they're a bit on the run and there is a lot going on. This one still does a good job of kind of, you know, the interpersonal relationships of these people and their differences, and I really liked this one. Next up is a book that I don't own, which is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. This is a book from the Women's Prize for Fiction, long list, short list. It was on both. And this is about a woman who, it's kind of an epic tale, and it follows 2 women. So one woman who is learning to fly planes, and the whole thing is kind of like an Amelia Earhart-esque, flying a plane around the world. And then the other part of it is an actress who is who's going to play Marion Graves, who is the pilot, on screen, and the different parallels between their lives and the things that go on. I enjoyed this, but I did think that it was a bit long, honestly, and there were times when I thought it was kind of a slog, but overall I really liked the characters and I liked the way the story tied up. So I thought they did a really good job, like bringing everything kind of full circle to some little tidbits from the beginning all the way to the end. So it was a really well written book, and I totally get why it was on the short list for the Women's Prize. And then I was sent by Book Hug Press Good Mom on Paper, Writers on Creativity and Motherhood. And this is a collection of essays that are about creativity and motherhood. And I feel like they are really about creativity and not so much about writing. So I think that this is still a good collection for someone who's not a writer. And I found this to have such really interesting, relatable moments as a mother myself. And I really enjoyed the fact that there were a lot of perspectives in this that touched on a lot of different lived experiences. And there was even one that was anonymous because she didn't want to tell her daughter's story without her consent, and I thought that was really beautiful. And I think that if you're looking for a good essay collection on motherhood, this is a great one because it is so varied. It even has this one mom who drew pictures of tantrums, and the tantrum pictures are in here, and she talks a little bit about the consent aspect as well in that essay, but all of this was phenomenal. Next up, I listened to the audiobook of Infinite Country by Patricia Engel, and this is the story of a girl who does something in kind of an impulsive moment and ends up in a girls' prison, and she is trying to get out of prison in time to make it to the airport to get on a plane to go to the United States, because she is actually a U.S. citizen. She was born in the United States, and her parents, one of her parents lives in Colombia and the other lives in the United States with her siblings. And this touches on kind of like how she got to this moment, the history of their family, and it's a really beautiful, like, heart wrenching portrayal of the things that families who are split apart due to immigration have to go through. And I loved this. So I would highly recommend this book. And then I picked up Swimming Lessons by Claire Fuller. And this was actually, it's funny because this was going to be the first Claire Fuller book that I picked up. Like, this is the first time I ever heard of Claire Fuller, and I was really interested in this book. I'm glad I didn't start with this one. I read Unsettled Ground first and absolutely adored that book. And this one, I just feel like it was just okay. So it still had all the things I love from Claire Fuller, the beautiful writing, the well fleshed out characters, but there was a lot in here. This was very much kind of like a study on people and how they can deceive themselves and each other. And we're following this daughter as she is realizing that her, you know, the things that she's thought all along may not be true. Her dad has been finding these letters written to her mother for years in books, and so it's like her mother telling her side of the story, and then but they have never heard it, but it's sort of one of those things where it's like, but is her mother really telling the truth, or is she telling her own version of the truth that may be more fiction than truth? So it was really interesting, and like when I think about it as like the complexities that it brought forward, I think that it was really well done, but I just didn't love this one as much as I've loved Claire Fuller's other books. And the last two I do not own. The first one is The Glucose Revolution. This is a nonfiction book. It looks like a weight loss book, but it's not really a weight loss book. Like, it has stuff in there about weight loss, but for the most part it's about glucose regulation and how even people who are not diabetic can benefit from glucose regulation, and how like of the vast majority of people have some level of dysregulated glucose, and how that can mess with your mood, mess with your weight, mess with your like ability to concentrate, your ability to stay awake, things like that. So it was super interesting, and I kind of want to get my hands on the physical copy of this book because I read it on it was a NetGalley arc that I read on my iPad. But I would like to get a copy of this in physical form so that I can tab it up, because I do think that there are some things in here that I would like to go back to. It's really about establishing habits around glucose and the way that, like the order that you eat foods in to help your body better regulate the glucose in your system. So it was really interesting, but you know, just a topic. Then I listened to the audiobook of The Secret Life of Albert and Twistle. This was also through NetGalley. This was an audio arc through NetGalley. And this was about an elderly man who is like coming up on retirement from the postal service, and it's set in the UK, and he is kind of coping with like, what is my life going to be, and also looking back on his childhood and his teen years and the things that have kind of led him to this point. And he's like a really lonely person. He doesn't talk to a lot of people, and something happens that kind of like compounds that loneliness, and he decides to make a choice to seek out this person from his youth and see if that person still wants to be in his life. So it's like this journey through like this cute little trying to find a person and tracking down all these clues, but it's also like this really hard-hitting story about internalized homophobia, and it was beautiful. Like, this is one of the best books that I think I've read in a long time that deals with that particular issue in such a poignant way. So I would highly recommend this one, because I really enjoyed it from both like an academic perspective, but also from like just sheer enjoyment perspective. And then in June, I participated in Whatever-a-thon. There are vlogs of all of these books for the most part, so I will link that playlist down below if you are interested in like in the moment thoughts on it, because they probably will be a little bit more detailed than what I'm going to give now. But I started off with, and then sort of throughout the month finished, the 3 volumes of Invisible Kingdoms, the graphic novel. This is really like a near future, potentially, like a futuristic series based on like the corruption between religious powers and like capitalist powers, and there was a lot of, you know, interplay with those two things. I found the art style to be not to my taste. It's very aggressive and like not particularly pretty to look at. I prefer more of like a cartoony or like soft style in graphic novels, and this was more on the end of like a comic book, so that put me off. And then the story was just mediocre, so I wouldn't recommend this one. If that art style is for you and you like that kind of concept of the interplay of religion and capitalism and near future futuristic sci-fi stuff, then maybe, but it didn't do it for me. Next was Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. There's a lot of Claires. By Claire Keegan. This book is a really slim volume. It's actually on the Booker long list. It might have made the short list. But anyways, it is about, I don't want to give it too much away about what it's about, but it's really like a small town, and a man witnesses something that makes him start to wonder what's really going on at this convent. And then it's sort of like how that unfolds, and like watching people and like the kind of stronghold that the convent and the church has on this town, and what happens when you push back against it. And it's a very quiet, beautiful novel that I will not soon forget. I thought it was beautifully done, written gorgeously, and something that I really enjoyed reading. Though the subject matter is a little like, enjoyed isn't the right word, but it was definitely one of my favorite things I read in June. And then I read a book that I've had for years, which was Legacy of Dragons Emergence, which is written by a local Chattanooga author. And this is a story about dragons. It's set in like actual Chattanooga, in our world. And it's kind of about like how dragons, something happened that like trapped dragons in human form. And then something has now happened that have let them free, and the consequences of that. And this girl who is trying to cope with the ramifications of it and fix whatever it is that's happening. And I thought this was really interesting. I'm glad that I finally read it because I did enjoy reading it. It is a little cheesy, and the cover of my book is awful, so enjoy this cover that's slightly better. And I would read the second one, just probably not anytime soon, to be honest. Then I read Tides by Sarah Freeman. This is a book that's told in like vignettes, and it's very much about someone struggling with grief. So this person has lost a child, their marriage has fallen apart, is falling apart, and she just leaves. It goes to this coastal town and is sort of like a grifter, like she's just doing things, odd jobs, doesn't really have anywhere to live, sleeping in different places until she sort of lands somewhere. And it's very, again, a quiet book that deals with a lot of kind of hard topics. I would say definitely trigger warnings for loss of a child and for miscarriage, but it's really also about her coping with the fact that she's never really felt like she fit in anywhere, that she was kind of different from everybody, and her life has just not been what she wanted it to be. And it was a good book, but nothing to like shout from the rooftops about, if I'm being honest. And then the next book I read was The Guide by Peter Heller. I don't still have this book. I actually sent it off to the used bookstore so someone else could enjoy it. Peter Heller's book, The River, was so good. The nature writing in that, and nature as a character, was one of my favorite things. I'm not hugely into thrillers, but I really, really enjoyed it, which is why I chose to pick this one up, because this was, again, something where it was like a thriller set in nature, and it kind of read like this. The synopsis basically talks about how this kid is a fishing guide, and he is at this like elite lodge where these people come to spend time, and it's like a quiet setting where they can just fish. But when he gets there, something sinister is kind of going on, and he starts to get involved. So when he arrives, the guide that was there has like disappeared, and he sees some things that make him feel like maybe that person didn't leave. And it carries on. I'm not going to spoil anything by telling you anything more. But I will say two things. The first one is, if you are interested in reading this book, I would highly suggest that you read The River first if you haven't, because there are spoilers in this for The River, because the guide, who is like the fishing guide, is one of the characters from The River. So you want to have read The River, or it will just like completely spoil the ending of that book. This character is dealing with a lot of PTSD as a result of the events of The River, and that PTSD is being dealt with in this book. But it also is set during COVID, which was something that I didn't know going in, and I'm not sure I would have picked it up if I had, because I'm just not ready for COVID fiction. And there is like there's some things going on that that the COVID setting makes sense, but also it was a little uncomfortable. So that's just to say, I would be aware of those two things going in. If you're still interested, then have at it. It was a good book. It was well written. I sped through it, but I felt like there were some things in there that didn't quite come together, and definitely didn't feel as cohesive as The River did. So I would suggest reading The River if you want to read something of Peter Heller's, and I would skip this one unless you just really, that premise sounds very interesting to you. Then, not going to say much about this, but I read Alfangor Secret, which is the third Megamorphs book in the Animorphs series. This is like a almost said side quest, kind of. This is not part of the like main book series, but it is part of the canon, so like things from this book tie into later books. We are following Alfangor, who is the Andalite who gave them morphing powers, and we find out more about his life, what brought him to the moment there in that construction site, and it added a lot of interesting things to the world. Then I read what might be one of my favorite books all year, which is Darius the Great Is Not Okay. This book was so good. It is a contemporary YA, and it is very focused on dealing with a lot of hard topics. So definitely trigger warnings for depression, for grief, all of that, bullying. And we're sort of following Darius, who has never really felt like he fit in. He wasn't enough. He wasn't Iranian enough, but he also wasn't American enough, and he didn't feel like he ever fit in. He goes with his family to Iran to see his grandfather, who is dying, and it just explores like the friendships he finds there, the things he and his family deal with. There's also this lovely tie-in of like tea, and Darius is a tea lover, and he talks about tea in a way that only a person, the author wrote this in a way that only a person who actively drinks tea would have written it, and I loved that as a tea drinker, so that was just like a bonus. But Darius is probably one of my favorite characters to have ever read about, and I loved this book. So if you haven't read it and you like YA contemporary, this is a definite must in my opinion. Then I listened to the audiobook of Just Your Local Bisexual Disaster. This was a NetGalley arc, and this was a really cute book. This was actually one of my most anticipated reads of the year. It's another YA contemporary. This is a queer story. Our main character is kind of dealing with not quite knowing where she fits in. She is bisexual, and she has always sort of felt like a disaster, hence the title. And so she uses a school project to help her kind of figure out her feelings about 3 people in her life, and kind of decide which one she wants to date. They don't know this is happening, and it's as much as a disaster as it sounds like it would be. But it was a really nice story, and it was a story that touched on a lot of things that queer youth, this is what I was gonna say, but then it made me feel really old, that queer teenagers would deal with, and I really liked this one. Next up, there was this one, which is Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok. Alok actually spoke at my work, and they gave such an incredible speech that really touched me, and answered some questions, and talked about their lived experience in a way that was just so warm and inviting, and it opened up a lot of dialogue, and it was fantastic. So I immediately bought their book, which is this slim little pocket edition, and I feel like if you feel like you need to read about gender and about what it means to be non-binary, I think this is a perfect place to start. This was a great little book, and I read it in one sitting, and I would highly recommend this. I feel like this should be like required reading on gender, honestly. I also reread the first volume of Heartstopper. Not going to talk about it too much, but it was as adorable and sweet as it was the first time around, and now I really need to watch the show. I know it's been out so long, but I just don't watch enough TV, so I haven't seen the show yet. But rereading the first volume made me want to watch the show. So maybe I'll do that this weekend. Then I read 2 volumes of a new graphic novel to me, which was Lightfell, which was about this sweet little girl who she kind of becomes friends with this thing. I can't remember what it was called. It's not a Galarian, I don't know. But this creature that people thought was extinct, and they go on adventures, and they're trying to keep the world from going black. There's these lights that they're trying to save, and it's like a quest and all of this, but it also has really good anxiety representation, because the girl has anxiety, and they do a really good job with this like visual representation as like a dark spiral of anxiety, and I loved that. And I just thought this graphic novel was beautiful, was fun, and was, touched on some great topics, and the plot was there too. So I'm really looking forward to what I think is a series, because the way it left off definitely felt like there was going to at least be a 3rd one, and I hope so, because I really liked this. And last but certainly not least is this gorgeous essay collection by a Myanmar author. This is called You've Changed, and it is a essay collection about the author's like growing up in Myanmar, and some different things about like the culture, but also about her just life and experience. There's a beautiful essay in here about her love of baking, and the kind of weird relationship she has with it, because of the fact that in Myanmar baking isn't really a thing, or it's not a common everyday thing. So like somebody wouldn't grow up learning to bake from their grandmother, because electricity tends to have rolling blackouts. So things like milk and eggs and things that you would need to refrigerate are not something that would be on hand constantly. So it was just interesting the way that she told the story about coming to her love of baking, but also like reckoning with why baking isn't a part of her culture and things like that. So there were some beautiful essays in here, and I feel like I would really benefit from rereading this, and I potentially might, because yeah, I just loved this. All right, so that was just me speeding through all of those books. like I said, for those books in June, I will link the Whatever-a-thon playlist down below, and I will have linked it up in the cards previously, because there are much better, like, in the moment reviews of those books than this. So if you haven't seen those, you can go back and check that. And yeah, do I only have one left? 2 left? I think I only really have 1 left to get caught back up with these reviews, wrap-ups, whatever you want to call them. I am a hot mess today. Anyways, if you want to see the rest of the wrap-ups as they come out, then make sure that you subscribe if you want to, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!